As the sun rose over the fjord, it illuminated not the idyllic landscape of a small Norwegian town, but the black, smoking skeleton of a house. The acrid smell of burning mingled with the morning freshness, and it was the scent of a tragedy. Just a few hours earlier, at Froðveien 14, there had stood a cozy two-story house belonging to Pastor Erik Johansson, but now, in its place, there was only a burnt-out ruin, still being doused with water by firefighters. It happened on the 14th of July, 2011. The first call to the emergency center came in at 2:53 in the morning. A neighbor, awakened by the crackling and bright light, frantically screamed into the phone that the pastor's house was burning like tinder. 7 minutes. That's how long it took for the first responders to reach the scene. But they were the longest 7 minutes in the history of Statvik. Flames were already bursting from all the windows, and the wooden roof had collapsed inwards, turning the building into a fiery cauldron. Extinguishing it was almost pointless. All the firefighters could do was prevent the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings and the dry forest at the foot of the mountain. At daybreak, when the battle against the elements was over, an investigative team arrived. Police tape separated what was left of the house from a crowd of shocked townspeople who stood in silence, looking at the ruins. Everyone knew this family. Everyone had loved them. And everyone prayed that by some miracle they had managed to escape. But the longer the firefighters searched the debris, the less hope remained. Soon, criminalists dressed in protective suits began their grim work. The report of the crime scene investigation would later contain dry, emotionless lines, but behind those words lay the image of a true hell. The first discovery was made where the second-floor bedroom was presumably located. Human remains, almost completely destroyed by the fire. 1 hour later, a second body was found at the other end of the floor. Identifying it on the spot was impossible. The horror grew with every minute, and then, beneath the rubble of the ceiling beams in the children's room, a third body was discovered. It was smaller than the others. The news spread instantly through the small town, plunging everyone into a state of collective shock. 3 bodies. The police began routine questioning of neighbors, and the puzzle seemed to be forming into the most tragic of all possible pictures. In this house, as every resident of Statvik knew, lived a family of 4. Pastor Erik, his wife Ingrid, their younger son Magnus, and their older 16-year-old daughter Astrid. 4 people, but only 3 of them were found in the fire. In this terrible arithmetic lay the last, desperate hope. But for the lead investigator, the same arithmetic became the central question. And while the whole town prepared to mourn 3 people, he already understood. The most important thing in this story was not those found in the ruins, but the one who was not there. The police learned the name of the person who had not been in the house almost immediately. While forensic experts sifted through the ashes for clues, investigators were already compiling a portrait of the family whose lives had been so cruelly ended. Official data confirmed the worst fears. In the rubble, 45-year-old Erik Johansson, pastor of the local Lutheran church, his 43-year-old wife Ingrid, a music teacher at the elementary school, and their son, 12-year-old Magnus, had died. 3 lives. 3 pillars of the small community, extinguished in a single night. But amidst this sorrow, there was one name that brought not grief, but a miracle. Astrid Johansson, the pastor's 16-year-old daughter, the sole survivor. To understand the extent of the tragedy, one had to grasp what this family meant to Statvik. Erik Johansson was not just a clergyman. He was the town's moral compass, a man to whom one came for advice, comfort, and help. His Sunday sermons filled the hall, and his word carried weight. Ingrid, his wife, was the embodiment of kindness and care. She taught children music, organized school festivals, and her smile, neighbors said, could melt even the harsh Norwegian snow. Their younger son Magnus was an ordinary, cheerful boy. He kicked a ball with friends after school, loved fishing and video games. They were the ideal family, like something out of a Christmas catalogue. Astrid, in turn, was their pride and joy. A quiet, modest girl with blonde hair and an impeccable reputation. Her angelic voice graced the church choir, and her name was always on the school's honor roll. In the records of the first interrogations, neighbors and acquaintances painted the same picture. They were the salt of the earth of our community, an exemplary family, one of the churchgoers would say. Astrid? She was a role model for everyone. Excellent grades, impeccable behavior, always helpful, her class teacher confirmed. Every Sunday, the whole family sat in the first row, the father at the altar, and the mother, daughter, and son in the hall. This image was as much a part of Statvik as the fjord and the mountains. So where was Astrid on that fateful night? The police received the answer to this question in the first hours, and it was as simple and logical as could be. That evening, the girl was at a summer youth camp, which the church organized annually on the shore of the fjord, just 4 kilometers from her home. The police found her there, in a tent, surrounded by crying friends and shocked counselors. She had already been informed of the tragedy. The poor orphan, whose guardian angel had apparently performed a true miracle. A lucky coincidence, nothing more. The entire community immediately surrounded the girl with care, ready to help her cope with the unimaginable grief. The tragedy had found its only glimmer of hope, and it seemed that a line could be drawn here. But for the investigators, this point was only the beginning of a long and convoluted path to a truth that would prove to be more terrible than the fire itself. And this path to the truth began not with witness interviews, but with the quiet and methodical sifting of ashes. In the first days after the tragedy, the most obvious version hung in the air: an accident. An old wooden house, built in the middle of the last century. Problems with wiring, a short circuit, a carelessly left heater. The causes could be varied. For the grieving town, this version, though bitter, was understandable. A coincidence. Fate. A tragedy for which no one but fate could be blamed. The investigation initially pursued this very direction. It was simpler. It was more logical. However, while the residents of Statvik brought flowers to the cordoned-off, burnt-out house, specialists from the fire investigation worked at the scene. These people do not speak to eyewitnesses, but to the traces left by the fire. For them, a burned-down house is not just a ruin, but a book written in the language of flames, and they can read it. They examined the nature of the damage, the direction of fire spread, and the burning temperature at various points, and very soon, a strange circumstance caught their attention. The most severe damage, the epicenter from which the fire began its destructive march, was not inside the house, but outside, at the front door and on the veranda. This was illogical for an accidental fire. The experts took samples from the charred planks, scraped soot from the foundation, and took soil samples at the entrance. All of this was sent to the laboratory. The results, which arrived a few days later, dispelled all doubt. Traces of chemical accelerants were found on the charred planks of the veranda and at the base of the front door. Simply put, a flammable mixture with which the house had been generously doused from the outside so that it would immediately burst into flames, leaving no one a chance. The version of faulty wiring crumbled to dust. This short line in the expert's report changed everything. The case was immediately reclassified. There was no longer an accident. Now the official document stated arson with 3 fatalities. The tragedy had turned into a cold-blooded triple murder. And somewhere out there, perhaps among those who brought flowers and expressed sympathy to the poor orphan Astrid, lurked the one who had brought a canister of gasoline to the pastor's house. Now it was no longer just work for the investigators. It was a hunt. And this hunt began at an impenetrable wall. When the investigators seriously approached the case, they encountered a disheartening fact. The Johansson family had no enemies. None at all. They were not just respected, they were popular. The police interviewed dozens of people, parishioners, Ingrid's colleagues from school, parents of Magnus's classmates, neighbors. The picture that emerged was always the same: a perfect family leading a quiet, righteous life. No debts, no business conflicts, no family disputes that outsiders would have known about. Pastor Erik was fair, but not cruel. Ingrid was kindness personified. Their children were the pride of their parents. The investigation had reached a dead end almost as soon as it began. In this equation, there were no unknowns that could have led to such a monstrous end. It was a murder without a motive, and thus without a suspect. While the detectives repeatedly reviewed the same facts, trying to find the smallest crack in the flawless facade of the Johansson family, invisible work continued in the forensic laboratory. The first report confirming arson was just the tip of the iceberg. Now, the experts conducted a detailed chromatographic analysis of the flammable mixture. They wanted to know not only what the house was set on fire with, but also the exact composition of this cocktail. And the result proved to be extremely interesting. It was not ordinary gasoline from a canister, nor was it kerosene. The basis of the mixture was a specific, rather rare household solvent used as a thinner for special boat paints, precisely those used to coat ship hulls to protect them from salt water. This detail was tiny, but incredibly important. Unlike gasoline, which can be bought at any gas station, such a specialized solvent is a niche product. One does not keep it in the garage just in case. One buys it for a specific purpose. For the investigators, it was as if they had found a fingerprint. The spirit who committed this crime suddenly acquired its first material characteristic. He was someone who needed precisely this composition. Someone who perhaps dealt with boats, or at least knew where to get such a chemical. The question who temporarily receded into the background. The main question was now, where? Where could such a solvent be bought in a small coastal town like Statvik? The answer was found faster than expected. The detectives called hardware stores in the area and quickly found out. Within a 50-kilometer radius, there was only one place that sold a solvent of precisely this brand and chemical composition. It was a small family-run store called Fjord Supply on the outskirts of town, where local fishermen and yacht owners came to buy paint, equipment, and other supplies. The hopeless case that had ended at a wall suddenly had a first concrete lead. The investigation finally had an address where it could ask questions. And while a couple of detectives prepared to ask questions at the Fjord Supply store, a report landed on their desk that seemed to solve the entire mystery in one fell swoop. During the questioning of parishioners, a name emerged: Knut Haugen. A former church board member whom Pastor Erik had, with shame and disgrace, expelled from the community about 1 year earlier. The reason was serious. Haugen had been caught in financial fraud involving donation money. For the investigation, this was like a gift from heaven. This was the perfect suspect they had so desperately lacked. A man with a name, a face, and most importantly, a solid motive. Revenge for public humiliation and financial loss. The deeper the police pursued this version, the darker details came to light. It was not a quiet, hidden conflict. It was open enmity. One of the church board members recalled for the record how Haugen, after his expulsion, had shouted directly at the pastor in the church parking lot, "You'll regret messing with me, you saint. You and your righteous house. You'll burn to the ground because of me." Words that had then sounded like the empty boasting of an injured man now sounded like a direct declaration of intent. Another witness who worked in the local cafe confirmed that she had heard Haugen complaining to a friend at a table just 1 week before the fire that Pastor Johansson ruined his life and someone has to pay for something like that. Motive, present. Direct threats, recorded. Character, hot-tempered and vengeful. It seemed the case could be closed. The detectives were already preparing to obtain an arrest warrant for him when the routine check of his alibi arrived, a formality that had to be observed, and this formality destroyed the seemingly perfect version. On the night of the 13th to the 14th of July, when the Johansson family's house turned to ashes, Knut Haugen was in the city hospital in Bergen, 150 kilometers from Stadvik. The day before, he had had an emergency appendectomy. His alibi was confirmed not only by official medical records but also by a dozen statements from doctors and nurses on duty. It was unshakable. The loud threats proved to be mere words. The main and only suspect was removed from the list, and the investigation, which had been close to a triumphant conclusion, was back at square one. Another dead end. And the only thread they had left led to that hardware store on the outskirts of town. And while some detectives drove to that hardware store, which had become their last hope, the lead investigator had another, no less important task. He was facing the official interview with the sole survivor, Astrid Johansson. The interview took place in a quiet office, in the presence of a social psychologist, as required by law when working with traumatized minors. Astrid sat opposite him, pale, composed, in a simple dark dress borrowed from one of the parish women. At first glance, the perfect picture of grief. "My parents, they were the best people in the world," she said in a quiet, even voice, looking directly at the investigator. "We were a very happy family. Magnus, he was my best friend. I don't understand who could have wished us ill." She spoke the right words. She painted the same idyllic picture as everyone else. Loving parents, obedient children, a home full of warmth and faith. She told how she had looked forward to the trip to summer camp, how she had hugged her mother goodbye not knowing it was the last time. Everything was logical, correct, tragic. The investigator listened, nodded, took notes. But something about her bothered him, something intangible in her behavior. And then, as the official part of the questioning ended, Astrid, after a short pause, asked her own question. It did not concern the investigation, possible suspects, or details of the tragedy. "Tell me," she asked, just as calmly, "how is it with the insurance now? My father always said that the house and our lives are highly insured. What documents are needed for that?" This question echoed in the silence of the office like a slap in the face. The psychologist tensed. The investigator froze for a moment. In his report, he would later dryly note, "During the conversation, minor A. Johansson repeatedly showed interest in the process of obtaining insurance benefits and inheriting the estate, and inquired about technical and legal details. It was such a sharp contrast to the image of the grieving orphan that it was impossible to ignore. One thing was a confused question about the future. Another was a business interest in the financial side of the tragedy, while the bodies of her loved ones had not even been identified. In his long career, the chief investigator had seen grief in all its forms. He had seen hysteria. He had seen a state of shock. He had seen quiet, silent tears. But he had never seen anything like this. Another handwritten note by him would appear in the interrogation record made after the conversation. During the entire conversation, the person did not shed a single tear. A complete absence of outward signs of grief or emotional distress was observed. This was not self-control, not willpower. It was an icy, detached calmness that was far more frightening than any sob. And at that moment, the investigator felt for the first time that the greatest mystery of this case was not hidden in the burnt ruins, but in the clear, cold eyes of the girl who was lucky enough to survive. And while the commissioner looked into those cold eyes and felt a shiver run down his spine, the rest of Stadtvik saw only what it wanted to see: a poor, orphaned girl who needed protection and compassion. And the community acted accordingly. The church immediately took Astrid under its wing. A commission was set up to manage her affairs until she came of age, and one of the town's most respected families offered her a room in their house. A fundraising campaign was organized. People brought money, clothes, and everyday necessities. The whole town came together to help the sole survivor of the Johansson family get back on her feet. But while the whole town mourned her, Astrid herself seemed preoccupied with entirely different matters. Barely 48 hours after the fire, using the telephone of the family who had taken her in, she made her first important call, not to a friend to cry, not to a psychologist, but to the central office of the insurance company to inquire about the policy number and the application procedure. Then she asked her temporary guardians to help her make an official request to the bank to obtain her parents' bank statements. And a few days later, after receiving some of the money from the donation fund, she asked to be driven to the next larger town. She returned with several bags from a chic boutique containing expensive, colorful clothes, completely unlike what someone preparing for their family's funeral would buy. Each of these actions, taken individually, could have been attributed to shock. But together, they painted a very disturbing picture that did not fit the image of the grieving victim at all. The investigators, continuing their routine questioning, returned to the witnesses from the youth camp, and one of Astrid's friends, after some thought, recalled a detail to which no one had initially attached importance. Both on the night of the tragedy and in the days preceding it, Astrid had repeatedly left the camp alone, ostensibly to go for a walk. She took her phone with her and walked towards the forest, where there was hardly any reception. Hardly. The girl remembered that Astrid had told her about a small hill from which one could catch a signal. She spoke with someone, for a long time, hidden from everyone. Who exactly? No one knew. In Astrid's phone, which the police had seized on the day of the tragedy, the call log was impeccably clean. The mysterious interlocutor was a phantom for the investigation, but it was precisely him they now had to find. And while one group of investigators tried to find this ghostly interlocutor by requesting a detailed analysis of calls from cell towers near the camp from mobile phone providers, another team returned to the only piece of material evidence they held, to that boat paint solvent. They drove to the Ford Supply hardware store. The owner, an elderly gentleman with a phenomenal memory, did not disappoint them. He not only remembered the sale, but could also give a detailed description of the buyer. Based on his words, a police artist created a composite sketch. A young man, about 20 to 22 years old, dark hair, confident look, not wearing local clothing. With this drawing in hand, the detectives walked through the town expecting a quick result, but they were disappointed. The composite sketch was shown to fishermen in the harbor, regulars at the town's only bar, and the postman, who knew everyone personally. The answer was only a shrug. No one knew this guy. In tiny Stadtvik, where a stranger stands out miles away, he was a true phantom. The investigation once again hit a wall, but the store owner's testimony was too important to ignore. His interrogation record stated, "Yes, I remember this young man very well. He came a few days before the fire, on Tuesday. You could tell right away that he wasn't from around here. So confident, almost a little cheeky. He didn't ask, he immediately said what he needed. 2 of the largest doses of Nautilus 7 solvent. I even asked if that wasn't a bit much. The paint is thick after all, but he just grinned. He paid cash, with large bills, and left. 2 large doses. Cash. A stranger. This was not a spontaneous act, but preparation. But who was he? The answer came from where it was not expected. As part of routine investigations, one of the detectives went to the school Astrid attended to speak with her classmates again and gather more information about her circle of friends. At the end of the conversation, almost without hope of success, he pulled out the composite sketch. Most teenagers just shrugged, but one girl suddenly froze. She stared at the drawn face for a long time and then said uncertainly, "I think I've seen him a few times." With Astrid. The investigator perked up. The girl said that a few weeks ago she had seen Astrid get into an old car with this guy after school. They talked about something and then drove off in the direction of the neighboring town. She mentioned the name she had heard from others. Lars Gunderson. The phantom from the composite sketch finally had a name, and this name led not only to an abstract arsonist, it led directly to the poor orphan, Astrid. For the investigators, this name became the key that opened the first real door in this case. Lars Gunderson, a simple query in the police database, and the phantom from the composite sketch gained flesh and blood. He was 22 years old. He did not live in Stadtvik, but in the neighboring larger port city of Fjellhamn, which explained why no one had recognized him. He was officially registered as unemployed and made a living with odd jobs on the docks. And most importantly, he had a previous conviction. Not for violence, not for robbery, for fraud. 2 years probation for defrauding an elderly woman of all her savings by promising her lucrative investments. This was the portrait not of a thug, but of a charming, cynical manipulator, a predator who preys on trust. He was the exact, absolute opposite of everything Astrid and her world embodied. The quiet, pious daughter of a pastor from a small town, and a convicted fraudster from the hustle and bustle of the harbor. How could their paths have even crossed? The answer to this question lay in the phone connection data. The police immediately requested official information from mobile phone providers, and what they received in response was not just confirmation of a connection. It was a veritable avalanche. In the last 3 months, more than 500 calls and almost 2,000 text messages were recorded between the number registered to Astrid Johansson and the number of Lars Gunderson. They talked several times a day. In the morning on the way to school, during the day during breaks, and they spoke for hours at night when the entire pastor's house was asleep. This was not just a friendship or a fleeting crush. This was an obsession, a secret life hidden from everyone, that the angel of the church choir led right under the noses of her perfect parents. But the most important thing awaited the investigators in the data from the 14th of July, the night the house burned down. At 2:10 in the morning, an incoming call from Lars to Astrid's phone. The conversation lasted 1.5 minutes. This was exactly 5 minutes before Astrid, according to her friends, complained of stomach pains and left the tent to go to the toilet. The next call was registered at 2:50 in the morning. This time, Astrid called. A short 20-second conversation. This was 3 minutes before the pastor's neighbor woke up to the crackling of the fire and dialed 112. The chronology came together with terrifying precision. Their phone conversations resembled a clock synchronization before the start of a special operation. The connection was proven. Now they had to find out what they had talked about. The police obtained an arrest warrant for Lars Gunderson and the seizure of all his electronic devices. He was quietly arrested in a rented apartment on the outskirts of Fjellhamn. He did not resist, but merely smirked crookedly and declared he knew nothing. At the same time, the investigators officially seized Astrid's phone as well. And here, a predictable but no less unpleasant surprise awaited them. Both phones were practically empty. The entire call log, all messages, all chats in messengers, everything had been completely deleted. They had tried to cover their tracks, to destroy the digital fingerprints of their secret. But in the modern world, the past cannot be erased so easily. Both devices were immediately sealed and sent to the digital forensics department. Now all they could do was wait to see what secrets the specialists could extract from the dead memory of these phones. And everyone knew what they found would become the core of this case. While the forensic specialists pored over the seized phones, trying to recover deleted data, Lars Gundersen sat in the interrogation room. He behaved not like a suspect, but rather like a guest who had grown bored with the proceedings. He slouched in the chair, sluggishly answered questions, and even managed to flirt with the policewoman who brought him coffee. When asked where he had been on the night of the fire, he merely grinned. The entire night of the 13th to the 14th, I was at my apartment. Alone. Watching movies, I think something with Stallone. You can check the streaming history if you want. I didn't go anywhere. His alibi was simple, ordinary, and at first glance quite credible. He was calm, confident, and seemed to have absolutely nothing to hide. But in the modern world, each of us has an invisible witness who monitors our every move. Its name is the mobile phone. Even if you only carry it in your pocket, it constantly communicates with the outside world, registering with the nearest cell towers. It's like leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs. The request to the mobile network provider was standard procedure, a routine that investigators carried out without great expectations. But the answer, which arrived a few hours later, was anything but standard. It was a veritable bombshell. The billing data showed that Lars Gundersen's mobile phone did not connect to the masts covering his neighborhood in Fjellhamn Harbor between 2 and 3 o'clock on the night of the fire. Not at all. Instead, it registered stably with the network of the only mobile phone mast that precisely covered that remote area on the outskirts of Statvik, where the Johansson family's house stood. The distance between Lars's apartment and the crime scene is more than 20 kilometers. The phone could not have received this signal by mistake. The digital traces led directly to the burnt-out ruin. Lars Gundersen was there. When the investigator silently presented Lars with the printout of the billing data and the map of the mast locations, his self-confidence showed its first, barely perceptible crack. He stared at the map for a long time, his jaw tightening slightly, and the complacent grin vanished from his face. He traced the line connecting his number to the mast at the Johansson's house with his finger and looked up at the investigator. The former audacity was no longer in his eyes. "Must be a network error," he said softly, but it didn't sound convincing even to him. "A technical defect. I'm telling you, I was home, but that no longer mattered. For the investigation, his alibi had officially ceased to exist. The question was no longer whether he was there. The question was, what were they doing there? And the answer to that was already maturing in the depths of the hard drives in the forensic lab. And while the forensic technicians removed digital dust layer by layer from the phones, the police's financial department performed its own, no less important work. They dug into Lars Gundersen's past, and the deeper they dug, the clearer his motive became. Lars was not only unemployed, he was broke. Serious credit card debt, rent arrears for his apartment, several small loans from acquaintances that he did not repay. He desperately, immediately needed money, and he was one of those who would not earn it through honest work. In parallel, the investigators requested statements from Astrid Johansson's savings account. It was her personal account, holding money she had received as a confirmation gift, about 8,000 kroner. In a traditional Norwegian family, this is almost sacred capital, the first step into adulthood. And the bank statement showed a very strange transaction. 3 days before the fire, on July 11th, the entire amount, down to the last krone, was withdrawn from the account. 8,000 kroner. In cash. The transaction was carried out at an ATM in the center of Statvik. 8,000 kroner in cash in the hands of a 16-year-old girl who was fully supported by her parents. That was already a warning sign. Where could this money have gone? The answer to this question was not long in coming. The money had not evaporated into thin air. The investigators began to check recent larger cash transactions in the area, and the trail led them to a small used car lot on the outskirts of Fjellhamn. The owner of the lot remembered his buyer well. 2 days before the fire, a young man came to him, introducing himself as Lars. He did not negotiate. He simply pointed his finger at the cheapest car on the lot, an old, worn Volvo, and asked for the price. When he heard 7,500, he pulled a wad of cash from his pocket without further ado and counted out the amount. Astrid had not only secretly met with him, she had given him all her savings. With this money, he bought a car. A vehicle with which, as the investigators were now convinced, they had driven together to her house on that fateful night. With this old Volvo, the investigation came full circle. Now they had not only a motive and evidence, but also a means of transport. The chain of evidence was almost complete, and the investigators decided to strike. They applied a classic tactic, designed to break even the most hardened criminals: parallel interrogations. In 2 different rooms, at the same time, without the possibility of communicating with each other, sat 2 people whose fates were now inextricably linked. In one, Lars Gundersen, who was still trying to play the tough guy who didn't care about anything. In the other, Astrid Johansson, who still maintained the mask of icy calm and exemplary victim. Both were sure of one thing: they had deleted everything. Direct evidence, their words, their plans, the police could not have. Lars's interrogation was personally led by the head of the investigation team. He started from afar, but quickly got to the point, laying out piece by piece of evidence on the table, like cards in a decisive game. First, the composite sketch and the statement from the hardware store clerk. Lars just shook his head lazily. "I don't know who that is. Looks like half the guys in Norway. I've never been to that store." Then the car salesman's statement, and the question about the 8,000 kroner. Here Lars became a bit livelier, sensing he could give a plausible answer. "Yes, I bought a car. Been wanting to for a long time. The money? I borrowed it from a friend, he can confirm that. He even gave a name that, as the check would show, was fictitious." Finally, the investigator silently placed the printout of the billing data on the table. Lars returned to his version. Network error. I was home. At the same time, another detective in the next room was speaking with Astrid. The tone here was softer, more sympathetic. She was still given to understand that she was a victim, perhaps having fallen under bad influence, but the questions were just as sharp. She was asked about the 8,000 kroner. Her answer was ready and, for a 16-year-old girl, impeccable. "I withdrew the money because I wanted to buy a new laptop for school. My parents were against such an expensive purchase, so I decided to do it secretly. But I never settled on a model. Logical, teenage-like." But her version no longer matched Lars's. He said a friend lent him the money. She said she was saving for a laptop. The wall of their lies got its first crack. When asked about the secret calls from the camp, she replied just as smoothly, "I was talking to a friend from Oslo. My parents considered her a bad influence, so I did it secretly." Both denied everything, but their separately fabricated stories were already beginning to contradict each other. The interrogations lasted several hours. The investigators went in circles, asking the same questions in different formulations, increasing the psychological pressure, pointing out the contradictions in their statements. But both Lars and Astrid held firm. They were like 2 rocks. They remained silent or repeated memorized answers. convinced that the investigation had nothing without their confession. The atmosphere in the interrogation rooms was taut. It seemed as if this confrontation had reached a dead end. And precisely at that moment, as Lars again repeated with a grin, "I was home," the door to the room opened. An assistant silently handed the lead investigator a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, scanned the short line of text, and for the first time that day, a barely perceptible smile appeared on his face. He slowly looked up at Lars. The cat and mouse game was coming to an end. On the paper were just a few words. "Recovery complete. We have all files." These few words on the paper changed the dynamic of the interrogation. The lead investigator said nothing. He simply stood up, left the room, and returned a few minutes later with a thick folder. He entered the room where Lars was being interrogated and silently presented him with the first printed sheet. Then he went out and did the same in the room where Astrid sat. On the sheets were no protocols or reports. They were screenshots of their own correspondence, recovered from the digital void. The words they had so carefully deleted had returned to testify against them. What the forensic scientists had retrieved from the phone's memory was not just proof of their connection. It was a detailed, step-by-step chronicle of the genesis and maturation of a monstrous plan. It all began a few months earlier with Astrid's complaints about her life. She wrote about how she was stifled by parental control, the hypocrisy of the church community, and the status of the perfect pastor's daughter. She called her home a golden cage, and Lars, an experienced manipulator, did not comfort her. He poured oil on the fire. "They don't understand you, princess. They keep you locked up because they fear your strength," he wrote. Gradually, his messages became more radical. He called her parents tyrants and her rules a prison. And then, about 1 month before the fire, a sentence appeared in their correspondence for the first time that sent shivers down the investigators' spines. Lars wrote, "There is only one way to achieve true freedom. Our liberation plan." From that moment on, their chat transformed from a love letter exchange into a planning committee for a crime. They discussed the details with terrifying coldness. In one message, Lars asked, "Have you checked about the insurance? We need to know the exact sum." Astrid's answer came a few hours later. "About 2 million kroner for the house, and 500,000 for each." Dad mentioned it once. They made plans for the future that would come afterward. "Imagine," Lars wrote, "no rules, no sermons, just us, the ocean, and our new life in Bali." They discussed how best to arrange everything, chose a day when everyone but Astrid would be safely at home. They even invented their alibi at the camp. All of this was there, in black and white, dozens of messages that combined to form an irrefutable picture of premeditated murder, a deliberately planned murder. When Lars and Astrid saw these printouts, their defense collapsed. The mask fell from both of them. Lars's confident grin gave way to pallor. Astrid's icy calm gave way to trembling. They could deny the billing data, the witness statements, the financial transactions, but they could not deny their own words. The agreement to commit the crime, the motive, the plan of action, everything was proven. Denial became pointless. Now it was only a matter of time before one of them would break down and start talking to try to save at least themselves. And that is exactly what happened. But they broke in different ways. Lars, upon seeing the printouts before him, did what his previous experience with the law had probably taught him. He fell silent. All his feigned bravado vanished, replaced by a sullen, heavy silence. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaned back in his chair, and stared at a spot on the wall. To all the investigator's questions, he responded with the same sentence. "I will only speak in the presence of my lawyer." He went into total defense, understanding that every word could now be used against him. But Astrid, her reaction was different. Seeing her own words, her secret thoughts, dragged into the light on paper, she broke down. Her icy calm, which had so unnerved the investigators, cracked and shattered into 1,000 pieces. Her shoulders trembled. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time during the entire investigation, tears flowed from her eyes. They were not tears of remorse. They were the tears of a defeated player, and through sobs, she began to speak. Her confession was a carefully crafted account in which she assigned herself the role of the misguided yet victim. It was all him. "Lars," she whispered, choked by tears. "I was so unhappy, and he was the first to understand me. He said my parents were tyrants, that they kept me in a cage. He told me that every day until I started to believe it myself." She recounted how Lars slowly but surely poisoned her mind, devaluing everything she held dear and replacing it with dreams of a fairy tale freedom. This plan, that was his idea from beginning to end. He called it our liberation. He planned everything, the day, how to do it. I was scared, I didn't want to, but he said it was the only way to be together, that it would prove my love. In her version, she was just a pawn in his terrible game. She admitted to withdrawing the money because he asked for it, said it was necessary for our future. She admitted to leaving the basement window slightly ajar because he ordered it. She was an obedient helper, a frightened girl who had fallen under the influence of an adult, experienced manipulator. The investigator listened to her without interrupting, and when she finished, he took the dictaphone with her recording and went into the room where Lars remained silent. He said nothing. He simply turned on the recording. Lars listened to Astrid's soft, faltering voice, and his face changed with each second. The sullenness gave way to confusion and then to pure, unadulterated hatred. He understood what she had done. She had not only confessed, she had shifted all the blame onto him, portraying herself as the lamb he, the wolf, had led to the slaughter. When the recording ended, he looked at the investigator and spoke for the first time of his own accord. "She's lying," he hissed. "Every word is a lie." And then followed a different narrative. In Lars's version, everything was exactly the opposite. "It was her idea," he said bitterly. "From the very beginning. It was she who hated her family, her life. She called her father a hypocrite and her mother a weak appendage. She dreamed of the day she would get rid of them." He claimed that Astrid was the first to talk about the insurance, that she found information on the internet about the house's construction and devised how to arrange the arson to look like an accident, a new life in Bali. Those are her words. She described for hours the house we would buy there with her blood money. Me? I was just a lovesick idiot who needed money. I got involved with her because she promised me everything. She is not a victim. She is the director of all this, and I was just her tool. 2 confessions, 2 versions of the same terrible night. Now the investigation had everything. All that remained was to find out who of them was lying, or, what was far more terrifying, whether both were telling the truth. For the investigation, it was a classic prisoner's dilemma. 2 suspects, locked in different rooms, trying to drown each other to surface themselves. But while Astrid and Lars painted their portraits, she in the role of the naive victim, he in the role of the betrayed lover, their contradictory statements, like 2 negatives when superimposed, created a single, terrifyingly clear and detailed image of that night. The investigators no longer had to guess. Now they knew everything. And this reconstruction of events, pieced together from their words and substantiated by cold facts, was more horrifying than any fiction. The countdown began at 2:15 on the night of July 14th, 2011. At that moment, 16-year-old Astrid Johansson, after complaining to a friend about sudden abdominal pain, slipped out of the communal tent at the church summer camp. She said she needed to go to the toilet, but she went in a completely different direction. She walked deeper into the forest, to where the campgrounds ended and darkness began. It was a step beyond the point of no return. 500 meters from the camp, on an inconspicuous forest road, Lars was already waiting for her. He was at the wheel of an old Volvo, marked by life, the same one that had been bought with her money, saved for her adult life. She sat silently in the front seat. The entire drive, all 4 kilometers to her house, they did not speak a single word. 5 minutes of driving in absolute, deafening silence. 5 minutes that separated them from burnt bridges and 3 extinguished lives. When they arrived, Lars turned off the engine some distance away, and they approached the house on foot, hidden in the shadows of the trees. The house slept. No lights were on in any window. Inside in their beds were her father, her mother, and her younger brother. Their actions were rehearsed like a script. While Astrid stood guard and watched the street, Lars retrieved 2 large tin cans of solvent from the trunk. He did not rush. Methodically, cold-bloodedly, he doused the wooden veranda, the front door, the wall under the living room windows with the flammable liquid. Then he went to the side wall of the house. There, as they had agreed, a surprise awaited him, which Astrid had left the day before, a basement window not securely closed. Lars smashed the glass, threw the second, almost full can inside, and squirted the remains from the first to create a second source of fire and leave no one a single chance. Then he pulled a lighter from his pocket. 1 click, and the dry, solvent-soaked house blazed up like a Christmas tree. They did not look. They turned and quickly walked to the car, while hell broke loose behind them. At 2:40, they were already driving away. And at 2:50, Astrid, as if nothing had happened, returned to her tent in the camp. She had been gone for about 35 minutes. When her friend asked if everything was all right, Astrid just nodded, said she was feeling better, and went to sleep. 3 minutes later, the neighbor's phone shattered the silence with a call to emergency services. This picture was not just the product of their imagination or mutual accusations. Every one of their words found confirmation. Expert analysis confirmed the presence of 2 independent sources of fire, outside the door and in the basement, which perfectly matched their narrative. On the forest road where Lars waited for Astrid, forensic technicians discovered tire tracks. They matched exactly the pattern of the worn tires of his old Volvo. And the testimony of Astrid's friend from the camp about her 30-minute absence was the final nail in the coffin of their lies. The picture of the crime was fully reconstructed. Now it only remained to present it to the court and let justice decide which of these 2 was the monster and who was merely its shadow. And now, after almost 1 year of court proceedings, justice was ready to give its answer to this question. June 2012. The Bergen District Courtroom. 2 people sit in the dock. They no longer look at each other. During the investigation and trial, their secret alliance, sealed by plans for a new life, had turned into poisonous hatred. Now they are merely accomplices awaiting their fate. The verdict, guilty, has already been pronounced, breaking the silence of the courtroom. All that remained was to hear the price they had to pay. The entire trial became a duel of 2 mutually exclusive versions. The prosecution insisted on a cold-blooded, carefully planned murder committed out of greed by a group of persons after prior agreement. The prosecutor meticulously built a picture based on the recovered correspondence, insurance data, and financial transactions. The defense of each of them, in turn, was based on the same tactic, shifting all blame onto the other. Astrid's lawyers painted a picture of a naive, psychologically oppressed girl who had fallen under the pernicious influence of an adult, cynical manipulator. Lars's defense, on the other hand, argued that his client had merely become a tool in the hands of a cold-blooded juvenile sociopath who had long and passionately harbored the desire to get rid of his family. The judge finished reading the judgment. There was a deathly silence in the courtroom, broken only by the quiet weeping of a former parishioner of Pastor Johansson in the back rows. Verdict: guilty of murder under aggravating circumstances and intentional arson resulting in death. Astrid Johansson, being a minor at the time of the crime, was sentenced to the maximum possible penalty in Norway for her age, 21 years of imprisonment. Lars Gundersen was sentenced to life imprisonment. Justice had rendered its verdict. But even behind these dry lines of the judgment, the most important, the most terrible question remained, one that no court could answer. And this most important, terrible question hung in the air in the courtroom, and then followed the convicted on different paths to their new state homes. Astrid Johansson and Lars Gundersen are serving their sentences in high-security prisons at opposite ends of the country. Since the verdict, they have never seen each other or exchanged a single word. Their toxic alliance, which had caused so much pain, crumbled forever. Both, of course, tried to appeal the verdict. Their lawyers filed appeals, repeatedly reiterating the same memorized mantras. He was a victim of her cunning, she a victim of his psychological violence. But the higher courts remained unyielding. Both appeals were rejected and the verdict upheld, which put an end to the legal side of this case, but not to the human side. And so this story entered the criminal annals of Norway, not only because of its cruelty, but also because of its great unsolvable paradox. The court could never definitively clarify who the quiet pastor's daughter really was. A naive victim who fell under the influence of an experienced manipulator, or a cold-blooded juvenile sociopath who found in Lars the ideal tool to fulfill her long-cherished dark desires. June 2023. County Clare, Ireland. This is a very quiet and secluded place, known for its peat bogs, where nothing seems to happen for decades. But sometimes the most mundane event can be the beginning of something terrible. It all started with a local resident taking his dog for a regular walk. At some point, the animal stopped and began actively digging the ground in one spot. The owner didn't immediately understand what his dog had dug up. At first, it looked like a simple bone and some dirty piece of fabric. But on closer inspection, he realized that the find looked wrong. That was enough to call the police. When the patrol car arrived at the scene, it became clear that it was not a false alarm. The area was immediately cordoned off, and soon forensic experts were working there. Their worst fears were confirmed. The bone was human. And the fragment of fabric turned out to be part of a simple woolen cardigan. Everything they found was carefully packed and sent for examination. The DNA analysis results were not long in coming. They confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to 19-year-old Aileen Murphy. The girl had been missing for 8 months since October 2022. She had been searched for, but without success. This find in the bog changed everything. A simple missing person case officially turned into a murder investigation. Now the investigation had to reconstruct Aileen's last days and understand what happened to her. To understand what led to the tragedy, the investigation had to go back. Back 8 months, to October 2022. The world was completely different then, because then Aileen Murphy was alive. And she was not just a name in a police report. She was a typical 19-year-old student who lived in the city and was trying to find her place in life. She studied veterinary medicine at college. Her grandfather instilled in her a love for animals since childhood, showing her how to care for livestock on the farm. In her free time, she worked part-time at a coffee shop, saving money for her small dream, an old, used car, so as not to depend on buses. There was nothing in her life that could indicate a connection to crime. She was at the beginning of her journey, and this path looked bright and clear. Family was central to this path. She had particularly close and, as everyone thought, unbreakable relationships with her maternal grandparents, Thomas and Agnes O'Sullivan. They were old-school farmers, people whose lives were built on hard work and adherence to tradition. In the district, they were known as the O'Sullivan family, uncommunicative but honest and decent people. Their secluded farm was a reflection of their characters, everything in its place, everything subject to a strict order that had not changed for decades. For Aileen, these trips out of town were a kind of ritual, an escape from the city bustle. Phone records, which the police would later examine, confirmed it. She called them almost every day, and visits to the farm were regular. Grandma Agnes always cooked her favorite apple pie, and Grandpa Thomas put aside his endless farm chores to talk to his granddaughter about everything. When detectives later interviewed witnesses, Aileen's parents, neighbors, her friends, they would encounter the same picture. The most ordinary, loving family. That's what they would constantly hear. No one could recall a single serious conflict, not a single quarrel. The O'Sullivan farm was synonymous with safety for Aileen. And so one October day, Aileen, as usual, decided to visit them. She called her parents. It was a short call, made literally on the run between classes at college. Her voice was cheerful and carefree. She said a simple phrase, "I'm going to Grandma and Grandpa's for a couple of days. Don't worry." At that moment, these words did not cause a single drop of concern. On the contrary, her mother and father were only glad. They always encouraged her communication with the older generation, believing that they had a good influence on her. It was a completely standard trip, one of many she had made before. No one could have imagined that this ordinary visit would turn into a disaster. Aileen was simply going to the people she loved and trusted most in the world. She did not yet know that this visit would be her last. This last visit, which began like all the previous ones, in an atmosphere of family comfort, came to its quiet and unnoticed end. 2 days passed. A normal morning dawned on the O'Sullivan farm. Thomas, having finished his morning rounds with the cattle, entered the kitchen. It smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Everything was as usual. Not seeing his granddaughter, he asked his wife a simple and natural question. "Where is Aileen?" Agnes, without looking up from preparing breakfast, replied in the even, everyday tone that Thomas had heard every morning for 50 years. She said that Aileen had left very early, even before dawn, while he was asleep. Allegedly, she needed to catch the first bus to the city to make it to some important college matters. For Thomas, this explanation sounded completely logical. Student life is full of hustle and bustle. He had no reason to doubt his wife's words. He simply nodded, poured himself some coffee, and sat down at the table. At this very moment, the first and most important lie was spoken, and it laid the foundation for the entire subsequent tragedy. Meanwhile, in the city, Aileen's parents were waiting for her return. At first, they were not worried. But when a day passed and their daughter still hadn't appeared or called, they began to get nervous. Her phone was off. The call immediately went to voicemail. Their first thought, of course, was to call the farm. Agnes answered the phone. Her voice sounded as always, calm and composed. She repeated the same story to them. Aileen had left early in the morning, rushing to the city. These words temporarily calmed the parents. Perhaps her phone had simply died. But the hours passed, and there was no news from Aileen. Evening passed. Night fell, Anxiety turned into fear. She was not a flighty girl who would simply disappear without warning. By morning, when Aileen's phone still didn't answer and she hadn't appeared at home, they realized they could no longer wait. Something had happened. The trip to the police station was difficult. There, in the sterile environment, their personal family panic turned into a standard procedure. The desk officer politely but methodically asked them questions, writing down the answers on a form. When did you last see her? What was she wearing? Does she have any tattoos or scars? Who was she friends with recently? The last point of contact known to the parents was that very call in which she said she was going to her grandparents. The O'Sullivan farm was recorded as the place where she was last seen alive and well. The procedure was completed. A missing person report was officially filed. From that moment on, Aileen Murphy was listed in the National Missing Persons Registry and her photograph appeared in police reports. The search began. The first days of a missing person investigation are always methodical, but often fruitless work. Detectives followed standard protocol. They interviewed Aileen's friends and classmates, checked CCTV footage at bus stations, and analyzed her recent calls and social media activity. But it was all in vain. The girl's digital trail ended the day she left the city. It was as if she had simply vanished. The investigation began to retrace Aileen's route step by step. All local taxi services in the Kilmore Village area were checked. Detectives spent hours reviewing call logs, interviewing dispatchers. And then, while checking records at one of the small taxi companies, they finally stumbled upon the right line. An order in Aileen Murphy's name, placed on the day of her arrival. The destination address was the outskirts of the village. The investigation had its first real lead, its first tangible thread. The driver who completed that order was also identified. Thus, the first key figure appeared in the case, a local taxi driver. The driver, a middle-aged man, was called to the station for an official statement. He was visibly nervous but willing to cooperate. In the formal setting of the interrogation room, the investigator asked him to calmly and in detail recount everything he remembered about that trip. The man confirmed that he had driven a girl who resembled Aileen from the photograph. According to him, she was quiet, listening to music through headphones for most of the journey. They exchanged a couple of insignificant phrases about the weather, nothing more. He clearly remembered the final destination of the route. His testimony was recorded in the protocol, and one phrase became key for the investigation. I dropped her off right at the turn onto the dirt road. That, as she said, leads to her grandfather's farm. She was alone. She paid in cash and walked towards the farm. I haven't seen her since. After the interrogation, the investigative team gathered for a meeting. Two main facts were now recorded on the whiteboard in the office. The first was the grandmother's words, conveyed by the parents, that Aileen had left the farm early in the morning. The second was the taxi driver's testimony, who claimed that he had dropped her off at the road leading to that very farm. And this second fact was critically important. It meant that the taxi driver was the last person, apart from family members, to see Aileen alive. His words were the only independent confirmation that she even reached those places. In such a situation, the detectives had no choice. They had to check this person with utmost thoroughness. He was the last link in the chain of known events. Therefore, the investigators made a decision, standard for such a situation. The taxi driver's status in this case changed. From an ordinary witness, he turned into a person of interest for the investigation. Now all attention was focused on him. The status of person of interest untied the detectives' hands. A warrant was immediately obtained for a full background check on the driver. The police began to dig, and they intended to dig deep. Detectives delved into his entire background: biography, possible past convictions, even minor administrative offenses. They contacted the taxi company, reviewing customer complaints from the past few years. Special attention was paid to his financial situation. They looked for sudden debts, large expenditures, any sign that the person urgently needed money, any motive. But the check yielded depressingly empty results. His record was clean. No police records, no complaints, stable financial situation. The picture was completely normal. But in a case where there was no other lead, this normality itself seemed suspicious. Since his background yielded nothing, investigators decided to increase psychological pressure. The taxi driver was called in for a second, much harsher interrogation. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. No formal politeness, only direct methodical pressure. The investigators asked him the same questions in different sequences, demanding clarification of the smallest details of the trip, the exact time, the phrases they exchanged with Aileen, her mood, her appearance. They made him repeat his story over and over, hoping to catch him in the slightest contradiction, looking for a crack in his story. But the man was unwavering. He did not break down, nor did he get confused in his testimony. Calmly and methodically, he repeated exactly the same thing as the first time. He drove the girl to the turn for the farm, she paid, and she left. He completely denied any involvement in her disappearance. His composure was so complete that it evoked two opposing feelings in the detectives. Either he was telling the absolute truth, or they were dealing with a very cold-blooded and calculating person. After the interrogation, the investigative team gathered again in their office. The taxi driver's photo still hung on the board, surrounded by many question marks. The dilemma was obvious. On the one hand, there was no direct evidence against this person, only the fact that he was the last one to see Aileen. On the other hand, they had absolutely nothing else. To dismiss this version meant returning to square one, to a dead end. Logic and police protocol demanded continuing to work with what they had. Therefore, a decision was made. The investigation of the driver as the main suspect would continue. At that moment, no other versions existed for the investigation. The taxi driver was and remained the main and only suspect in the disappearance of Aileen Murphy. But to move forward, mere suspicion was not enough. Detectives needed facts that would either prove his guilt or completely disprove it. And they decided to turn to an impartial witness who does not lie and forgets nothing, to technology. The investigation sent an official request to the taxi company demanding full access to the data from the onboard GPS tracker installed in the driver's car. They were interested in a specific file, the complete track of all car movements for the day Aileen arrived in the village. A person's words can be questioned, their memory can fail, but impartial satellite data is a different matter entirely. Soon, the data was received. The file with the detailed route, minute by minute recorded by the system, landed on the analyst's desk. It was meticulous, almost meditative work, to compare every word of the driver from the interrogation protocol with every point on the digital map. On one screen, his testimony on the other, a line showing the actual route of the car. And the deeper the analyst delved into the data, the clearer the picture became. The route to the turn for the farm, the travel time, a short stop to drop off the passenger, everything matched to the second. But the detectives went further. They tracked his entire workday, before and after the trip with Aileen. The police found and interviewed several other passengers he transported that day. A student going to the library, an elderly woman returning from the market. These people had no connection to the case or to each other. And their testimonies, one after another, fit into the overall picture, confirming the tracker data and the driver's own words with absolute accuracy. The taxi driver's alibi became ironclad. He simply had no time or window to commit any crime. Ultimately, the analyst prepared a final report on the check. It was a short, dry document that put an end to this stage of the investigation. The main conclusion was formulated clearly and unemotionally. GPS tracker data and testimonies of independent witnesses fully confirm the driver's alibi. No contradictions were found in his testimony. This report completely destroyed the only working theory of the investigation. The taxi driver was officially excluded from the circle of suspects. His name was erased from the whiteboard in the investigator's office. The only thread they had been pulling so long and hard snapped. The investigation, which seemed about to move forward, rolled back to its very beginning. After weeks of intense work, the police again had nothing. A complete dead end. When an official investigation reaches a dead end, ordinary people, driven by compassion and hope, often take the initiative. That's what happened this time. In November 2022, when it became clear that the police were stalled, neighbors and friends of the Murphy family organized large-scale search parties. Dozens of volunteers flocked to Kilmore to comb the fields, forests, and peat bogs around the O'Sullivan farm. The center of this desperate operation became the house from which, according to the official version, Aileen left on that fateful morning. Roles in the family distributed themselves. Thomas O'Sullivan, an aging but unyielding man, went out with the volunteers every day. With a map in hand, he pointed out routes, combed the most inaccessible areas, his face a mask of grief and determination. He was looking for his granddaughter. Agnes O'Sullivan remained on the farm. Her role was different. She became the emotional and logistical center for all searchers. Her kitchen turned into a headquarters. There was always hot tea and coffee, pots of soup, homemade baked goods. She was our rear guard, one of the neighbors later recalled. She met us when we returned cold and tired, and always found words of encouragement, saying that we shouldn't lose hope. In the eyes of the entire community, she was a model of resilience. The most eerie scenes of this drama unfolded in the evenings, when the volunteers left and silence fell on the farm. Thomas, broken and devastated by another fruitless day, returned to the house. He sat in the kitchen, his shoulders slumping under the weight of grief. In a quiet voice full of despair, he told his wife where they had searched today and again found nothing. He shared his grief with the only person whom, he believed, shared his pain to the fullest. Agnes sat opposite him. She listened silently, nodded, poured him hot tea. She placed a plate of dinner in front of him. She comforted him with words that perhaps tomorrow they would be more fortunate. And in these simple, everyday gestures, for us who know the truth, lay the whole horror of the situation. A man who had lost his granddaughter sought solace from her killer. And the killer, his own wife, played the role of a compassionate and grieving grandmother every evening. To everyone around them, they were an elderly couple facing unimaginable tragedy and supporting each other. Agnes was a pillar of support for her broken husband. But weeks went by, and the searchers' enthusiasm began to wane. At first, people went out every day. Then, only on weekends. And then, winter finally took hold. Torrential rains made the bogs impassable, and hope almost died out. The active phase of the search subsided. Life on the farm returned to its slow, habitual rhythm. Thomas and Agnes continued to live under one roof, having breakfast, lunch, and dinner together. The secret was buried literally a few kilometers from their home, and only one person in this family knew about it. Months passed. Case number 22-4815, the case of Aileen Murphy's disappearance, was shelved, receiving the status of unsolved. Winter gave way to spring. 2023 arrived. Silence. This is the main word that could describe Aileen Murphy's case in the first half of 2023. For the police, it was a cold case. For the family, an unhealing wound. For society, an almost forgotten tragedy. Time passed, and it seemed that the mystery of the girl's disappearance would forever remain buried under layers of Irish peat. But sometimes, nature itself intervenes. June 2023 arrived, and with it, the season of torrential rains that lashed County Clare. Rivers overflowed their banks, and the peat bogs, saturated with water, became unstable and mobile. The earth, which had kept its secrets for centuries, began to reluctantly yield them. On one of those grey, rainy days, a local resident, the same one who 8 months earlier had discovered the first clues, was again walking his dog along the edge of the peatlands. Now the viewer knows what they are looking for, and this gives the scene a new meaning. The animal, attracted by a scent that had broken through the wet earth, began to dig again. This time, not only bone fragments, but also a large, well-preserved piece of woolen fabric emerged from the eroded soil. News of the find instantly reached the investigative department, and the case, gathering dust in the archive, was urgently reopened. An augmented team of forensic experts immediately arrived at the scene. The area was cordoned off for several hundred meters around. A tent was set up over the excavation site, and painstaking work began to extract everything the earth had hidden. Every fragment, every thread was meticulously documented, packed, and sent to the laboratory. The primary task was to conduct a DNA test and compare it with samples taken from Aileen's parents at the very beginning of the investigation. Waiting for the results was not long, but for all participants in the case, those few days dragged on like an eternity. Finally, the official report arrived. The dry lines of the document shattered any hope. The DNA profile extracted from the found remains matched Aileen Murphy's DNA by 99.9%. The fabric was identified as a fragment of the cardigan in which, according to her parents, she had left for the farm. This was the end of the story of the missing girl and the beginning of the story of a brutal crime. The case was immediately and officially reclassified from missing person to murder investigation. This was no longer just a tragedy, it was a murder. And a murder always has a killer. This new status completely changed the investigation's approach. Now they were looking not for a missing person, but for a crime scene. First, detectives plotted the exact coordinates of where the remains were found on a large map of the area. And when the red flag was stuck into the map, it became obvious to everyone in the room what had previously gone unnoticed. The burial site was in close, walking proximity to Thomas and Agnes O'Sullivan's farm. The farm instantly changed its status. From the quiet home of grieving grandparents who were merely witnesses, it became the central object of the investigation. The logic was simple and relentless. If the body was found here, then there's a high probability that traces of the crime should also be sought nearby. A warrant was issued for a new, most thorough forensic search of the entire farm territory. Now detectives had to return there not as guests, but as investigators treating the place as a potential murder scene. One day in July 2023, the idyllic silence of the O'Sullivan farm was broken by the rumble of a diesel engine. An unassuming van, which, however, meant more to the investigation than a dozen patrol cars, pulled up to the house. It was a mobile forensic laboratory. From that moment, the search escalated to a completely new, microscopic level. Now investigators were looking for what was invisible to the human eye. The team of experts in white suits methodically began their work. Their main tool was luminol. This chemical compound reacts with the iron in blood hemoglobin. Even if traces had been thoroughly washed away many months ago, luminol makes them glow with an eerie blue light in the dark. The first object of inspection was the residential house. Forensic experts treated everything with the reagent: kitchen floors, hallway walls, furniture, bathroom drains. But room after room yielded the same result: nothing. The house was impeccably clean. Then the focus shifted to the numerous outbuildings scattered around the farm. The investigators' attention was drawn to one object: an old, leaning peat shed that had not been used for a long time. It stood isolated, emanating an aura of neglect. It was an ideal place to hide something. The shed doors were opened and the experts entered. The air was heavy and smelled of damp earth. By day, it was just a dark, cluttered room. But the forensic experts were about to look at it in a different light. The procedure began. Windows and crevices were tightly sealed, plunging the shed into absolute darkness. In the silence, the hiss of a sprayer was heard. Luminol was evenly applied to the walls and earthen floor. Several minutes passed for the reagent to soak in. Then, one of the experts switched on a powerful ultraviolet lamp. At first, there was nothing. But then, slowly, as if developing in an old photograph, an eerie, distinct blue-green glow began to appear on the floor and at the base of one of the stone walls. It had the shape of splashes and small trickles. Traces had been found. Now, this glow needed to be turned into irrefutable evidence. Each glowing area was marked. Forensic experts using sterile instruments took several soil samples and scraped the wall. Each sample was packaged in a separate container, sealed, and immediately sent to the same laboratory that had identified Aileen from the remains found. Again, there was a pause, a waiting period, as science did its work. The entire investigation now depended on the results of this analysis. The answer came several days later and was absolutely unambiguous. The laboratory report stated, "The DNA profile extracted from biological traces found in the shed perfectly matched Aileen Murphy's DNA profile." This was a breakthrough. The investigation now had not just a theory based on geography. They had physical evidence. Aileen Murphy's blood was at her grandparents' farm. The crime scene, or at least the place where her body had been temporarily located, was established. And it was right here. Now that the crime scene was established, the investigation changed its scope. The wide net cast at the very beginning narrowed down to a single point on the map, the O'Sullivan's farm. And the circle of suspects shrank from anyone to two specific people, Thomas and Agnes. The logic was relentless. If the traces of the crime are here, then the person responsible for it is most likely one of the residents of this house. But who? To answer this question, investigators needed to establish the exact time Aileen was killed. Forensic experts revisited the very first data in the case, the victim's digital footprint. By analyzing the time of her last sent message and the last signal her phone transmitted to a cell tower before being turned off, they were able to outline an approximate window. The crime occurred on Friday evening, the same day Aileen arrived at the farm. The investigation now had a specific evening for which they needed to check the alibis of both elderly people. The task sounded simple. Find out where Thomas and Agnes O'Sullivan were on that October evening in 2022. They decided to check Thomas first. When asked what he was doing that Friday, his answer was quick and confident. He, like every Friday for the past 30 years, spent the evening at the village pub, the Wishing Well. It was his unbreakable tradition. After a hard week, meet with friends, have a pint of beer, and discuss local news. Detectives immediately went to the pub to verify his words. The work of verifying this alibi was methodical but simple. Investigators spoke with the establishment's owner and the bartender who worked that shift. They showed them a photograph of Thomas. Both, without hesitation, confirmed, yes, he was here. Then the police obtained a list of regular customers and began calling and questioning them one by one. Farmers with whom Thomas sat at the same table, neighbors from the village, just casual visitors. Dozens of unrelated people gave the same testimony. Thomas O'Sullivan arrived at the pub around 7 in the evening and left closer to midnight. He was in plain sight of everyone. His alibi was not just good, it was ironclad, irrefutable. After this, the equation on the investigator's whiteboard became extremely simple. There were 2 adults on the farm on the evening of the murder. One of them, Thomas, had a 100% alibi, confirmed by dozens of witnesses. Logically, all attention now shifted to the second person, When detectives asked Agnes O'Sullivan the same question, her answer was quiet and short. She said she was home alone all evening, doing chores, and went to bed early. There were no witnesses to this. Her alibi was silence and an empty house. By simple elimination, the picture of the crime turned upside down. The woman who baked pies for volunteers, who comforted her husband, who testified to the police as a grieving relative, remained the only person on the farm without an alibi at the time of her granddaughter's murder. The investigation came to its shocking but logically inevitable conclusion. Agnes O'Sullivan ceased to be a witness. Now her name was written on the whiteboard in the investigator's office under another, much more terrifying word: suspect. So the suspect's name was on the board. But that was just the first step. To build a case that could stand up in court, detectives needed to answer the main, most difficult, and at first glance, absurd question. Why? Why would an elderly, universally respected woman who doted on her granddaughter commit such a monstrous act? The image of a loving grandmother did not at all fit the image of a cold-blooded killer. To find the answer, investigators had to dig deeper, and this time they focused not on the suspect, but on the victim's secret life. By court order, detectives gained full access to Aileen Murphy's financial information. Analysts began examining her bank accounts, online payment history, any activity that could shed light on her real situation. And what they discovered completely changed the perception of the quiet and diligent student. Over the past 1.5 years, tens of thousands of euros passed through her accounts. The money came in and almost immediately went out in the same direction, to the accounts of offshore online casino and bookmaker websites. Further checks showed that Aileen had a serious gambling addiction, hidden from everyone, which led to large debts. Now the investigation had the first part of the puzzle. The victim had a sharp and constant need for money. But where did she get it? The next logical step was to analyze the financial situation of Agnes and Thomas O'Sullivan. Their bank accounts did not clarify the situation, rather they added more questions. After decades of hard farm labor and extremely frugal living, they should have accumulated substantial savings. Yet there were only insignificant amounts in their accounts. Detectives began questioning neighbors and old acquaintances of the family, and a crucial detail emerged. Many recalled that Agnes had always distrusted banks and said that it is safer to keep money close at hand. It was an epiphany. Two seemingly unrelated lines of investigation, the granddaughter's debts and the grandmother's invisible savings, intersected at one point. The investigation developed a working hypothesis. Agnes O'Sullivan had been accumulating cash for years and hiding it somewhere on the farm. Aileen, often visiting them, somehow found out about this stash, and under the pressure of debts, she began to take money from there, little by little, hoping that the elderly woman would not notice the loss. All that remained was to reconstruct the events of that fateful evening. They did not have a recording of the conversation, but based on psychology, facts, and evidence, they were able to recreate the most probable scenario. Aileen came to the farm not just for a visit, but with a specific purpose: to take another sum of money. But this time, something went wrong. Perhaps Agnes decided to check her savings that very day and discovered that almost everything she had saved her whole life was gone. She realized who could have done it and decided to talk to her granddaughter directly. This last conversation became the point of no return. Investigators hypothesized that Aileen, cornered by her addiction, did not apologize or repent in response to direct accusations. On the contrary, she behaved defiantly, perhaps even demanding more money. For Agnes, whose life was built on labor, frugality, and sacrifices for the family's future, this was not just theft. It was a betrayal. Her entire life, all her efforts, were destroyed by the closest person. The investigation's version was finally formulated. Motive: a suddenly arising conflict over stolen savings, escalating into uncontrolled rage and murder committed in a state of emotional distress. Now the investigation had the complete picture: evidence, a suspect, and most importantly, a motive. The theory was built. There remained the last, final act of the police investigation: a direct confrontation with the person who, according to their version, stood at the center of this whole tragedy. It was time for a formal interrogation. Agnes O'Sullivan was summoned to the police station, but this time, the subpoena did not come to a witness. It came to a suspect. The atmosphere was completely different from their previous conversations. This was not a quiet farm kitchen, but a cold, impersonal interrogation room with bare walls and metal furniture. Everything was being recorded by a video camera mounted in the corner. Next to Agnes sat a state-appointed lawyer who had instructed her to answer questions briefly and to the point. Opposite them sat two detectives who had been handling the case from the very beginning. On the table between them lay a thin folder of documents. The game of the grieving grandmother was over. Opposite them sat Agnes O'Sullivan, a quiet elderly woman in a simple dress with wrinkled hands folded on the table. She looked calm, almost detached. After the standard formalities, the lead investigator looked her directly in the eyes and made the first move. His voice was level and devoid of emotion. Mrs. O'Sullivan, during the search of your farm, traces of blood were found in the old peat shed. Laboratory analysis confirmed that this blood belongs to your granddaughter, Aileen Murphy. Could you explain how it got there? There was a long pause. Agnes's face did not change. Her voice was quiet but firm. This is some kind of mistake. It cannot be. My granddaughter left us that morning. No tears, no panic. Just cold, stubborn denial. She had built a wall, and now the detectives were going to methodically, brick by brick, tear it down. The investigator opened the folder. All right, let's talk about that evening, Agnes. Your husband, Thomas, was at the Wishing Well pub. He has an ironclad alibi confirmed by dozens of witnesses. And where were you? I was home. Alone, she replied calmly. So, there are no witnesses to your alibi. You were alone on the farm with Aileen, the detective stated. Agnes remained silent. He continued, moving to the next point. We have learned that Aileen had serious financial difficulties. She was addicted to gambling and had accumulated large debts. Did you know about this? No. I know nothing about it. She was a good girl. Her voice did not waver. We also know that you and your husband worked hard and saved all your life, but there is almost no money in your bank accounts. However, there is evidence that you did not trust banks and preferred to keep your savings in cash. Is that so? We lived modestly, Agnes replied evasively. To every argument, to every piece of evidence presented, she responded either with complete denial or with short, meaningless phrases. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply stuck to her original version. She left in the morning. We loved her very much. The interrogation lasted several hours, but the investigators could not break through this wall. They approached from different angles, changed tactics, but Agnes was unwavering. Finally, the chief detective put down the documents and leaned forward slightly. His voice became quieter, almost confidential. Agnes, we don't think you're a monster. We know you loved your granddaughter. Perhaps something went wrong. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe you just had a quarrel. Help us understand what happened there. Help the rest of your family learn the truth. Agnes was silent for a long time, looking at her hands. A tense silence hung in the room. The detectives waited. But when she looked up, there was neither remorse nor fear in her eyes, only cold emptiness. She left in the morning. she repeated one last time. That's all I know. The interrogation ended there. The wall did not give way. But the investigation had enough circumstantial evidence to proceed. That same evening, based on the discovered blood, the lack of an alibi, and the established motive, Agnes O'Sullivan was officially charged with second-degree murder. The elderly farmer, a pillar of her family and local community, was now officially accused of murdering her own granddaughter. The case was ready for trial. The case of Agnes O'Sullivan was strong, but from the prosecution's perspective, not perfect. It was built on a combination of compelling circumstantial evidence, the victim's blood on the farm, the suspect's lack of an alibi, and a convincing motive. But to leave the jury no room for doubt, the prosecution lacked one thing: the final material evidence that would directly link the killer's hand to the act. They needed what is called a smoking gun in police slang. They needed to find the murder weapon. Prosecutors and detectives repeatedly examined the medical examiner's report. The conclusion was unambiguous. The cause of death was multiple head traumas, inflicted with great force by a heavy, blunt object with a rounded, striking surface. This phrasing was the key. The murder was spontaneous, committed in a fit of rage. This meant the weapon was not brought in. It was grabbed in haste at the location where the conflict erupted. The reconstruction of events pointed to the kitchen. And then the investigators asked themselves a simple question: what heavy, blunt object with a rounded surface could be found in the kitchen of an old Irish farmhouse? The answer was obvious: a heavy cast-iron skillet. A warrant was issued for a final targeted search. Forensics experts returned to the farm, but this time they were interested in only one room: the kitchen. They were not looking for bloodstains on the walls. They were looking for a specific item. A set of old, heavy cast-iron skillets hanging on hooks near the stove attracted attention. They were old, blackened from decades of use. At first glance, the most ordinary kitchen utensils. The skillets were carefully removed, packaged as evidence, and sent to the laboratory. In the sterile silence of the forensic laboratory, the most painstaking work began. Under a powerful microscope, a specialist methodically, millimeter by millimeter, examined the surface of each skillet. He was looking for something that could not be washed or wiped away without a trace. He checked the most inaccessible places: micro scratches, chips, and especially the attachment point of the handle to the base of the skillet. Hours passed. One skillet, a second, clean. And then, on the third, heaviest skillet, in a tiny crevice between the metal handle and the cast-iron base, he noticed something. A tiny, almost imperceptible foreign inclusion of dark color, baked in from the high temperature of the stove. This was a eureka moment. With a sterile scalpel, the lab assistant extracted these microscopic particles. There was an infinitesimally small amount, but for modern DNA analysis, it was enough. The sample was sent for final examination. This was the last check in this case, and absolutely everything depended on its results. A few days later, the report landed on the chief prosecutor's desk. The conclusion was short and damning. The DNA profile extracted from the microparticles found on the skillet perfectly matched Aileen Murphy's DNA profile. This was the irrefutable evidence that the prosecution had been missing. They had not only the crime scene, motive, and a suspect without an alibi. Now they held the murder weapon with the victim's biological traces on it. The trap had now sprung shut. The case was fully ready for trial, and the prosecution had all the cards in hand. The case was fully ready for trial, and the prosecution had all the cards in hand. In April 2024, the trial for the murder of Aileen Murphy began in the County Clare District Court. The atmosphere in the courtroom was oppressive. This was not just a criminal drama, but a family tragedy unfolding before everyone's eyes. Agnes O'Sullivan sat in the dock. The same quiet, detached elderly woman who seemed not to fully understand where she was and what she was accused of. In the hall, on the public benches, her husband, Thomas, sat every day. In the months since his wife's arrest, he had aged 10 years. He silently watched the proceedings with an expression of complete bewilderment and pain on his face. He was the second silent victim of this crime, a man whose world collapsed overnight. The trial began. The prosecutor rose to deliver his opening statement, promising the jury that he would present them with a clear and irrefutable chain of evidence that would leave no doubt as to the defendant's guilt. And he kept his word. The prosecution methodically, step by step, built its version of events before the jury. They started with the motive. The prosecutor presented the court with Aileen's bank statements, her activity history on online casino sites, and the testimony of a gambling addiction expert. He painted a picture of a desperate girl, mired in debt. Then he linked this to the O'Sullivan family's financial situation, presenting evidence of their hidden savings and speaking of the thefts the granddaughter had committed. Next came the evidence. One by one, they were placed before the jury, creating an irrefutable picture. The prosecutor called dozens of witnesses from the Wishing Well pub who confirmed Thomas's ironclad alibi. Then he proved Agnes's complete lack of an alibi. After that, he presented the forensic report and photographs of the luminol's blue glow in the peat shed, the victim's blood on her property. And finally, the climax. A sealed container with the very same cast iron skillet was brought into the courtroom. The prosecutor read the expert's conclusion about the microparticles found on it with Aileen Murphy's DNA. The defense tried to dispute the circumstantial nature of the evidence, but they could not refute any of these scientific facts. Finally, the most tense moment of the trial arrived. Agnes O'Sullivan was called to testify. Absolute silence fell in the courtroom as she slowly walked to the witness stand. Her own lawyer asked her the main question. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, did you kill your granddaughter, Aileen Murphy?" "No," she replied softly but firmly. During cross-examination, the prosecutor methodically went through each piece of evidence. "How did Aileen's blood get into your shed?" "I don't know." "How did her DNA end up on your skillet?" "I have no idea." "Where, in your opinion, did she disappear after she supposedly left the farm?" "I don't know." She could not provide a single, logical explanation. To all questions, she answered the same thing. She woke up in the morning, and her granddaughter had already left. By the end of her testimony, the huge gap between reality and her words became obvious to everyone in the room. On one side was a mountain of solid, scientifically confirmed evidence, arranged in an impeccable logical chain. On the other was a simple, stubborn, and unsubstantiated denial. The judicial investigation was concluded. The prosecution's story was complete and consistent. The defense's story consisted of a single phrase that contradicted all facts. Now the decision rested with the jury. To help them make this choice in his closing argument, the prosecutor did not simply list dry facts. Instead, he invited the jurors to walk through that terrible October evening with him, reconstructing the only version of events that explained each piece of evidence presented. He began with the moment silence fell on the farm. Thomas, by his long-standing habit, had left for the pub. Aileen and Agnes remained alone in the kitchen. It was at this moment, the prosecution argued, that Agnes, having discovered the disappearance of almost all her savings, decided to speak directly with her granddaughter. The prosecutor described how, in response to the accusations, Aileen, cornered by her addiction and debts, did not repent or apologize. On the contrary, she behaved defiantly, perhaps even demanding more money to win back her losses. For the elderly woman, whose life was built on self-sacrifice and hard work, this was the last straw. It was a betrayal that nullified everything. At that moment, according to the prosecution, Years of love turned into blind rage. Agnes O'Sullivan, in a fit of passion, grabbed the first thing that came to hand, a heavy cast-iron skillet. Next, the prosecutor moved from the emotional outburst to the cold-blooded cover-up. He described how, after the act, Agnes came to her senses and realized the full horror of what had happened. But instead of calling the police, she began methodically covering her tracks. First, she thoroughly cleaned the kitchen of bloodstains. This explained why the initial search of the house yielded nothing. Then, under the cover of evening, she did something that required enormous physical and moral effort. She single-handedly dragged her granddaughter's body across the yard to an old, abandoned peat shed. It was a temporary hiding place to conceal her terrible secret until deep nightfall. The most chilling part of the reconstruction concerned what happened when her husband Thomas returned from the pub and fell soundly asleep, suspecting nothing. The prosecutor described how Agnes, waiting for complete silence, wheeled out a garden cart. In several trips, under the cover of darkness, she transported the body deep into the peat bogs and buried it in a shallow, hastily dug grave. To completely erase all traces of her granddaughter's presence, she gathered her personal belongings, a backpack, clothes, and most importantly, her mobile phone, and burned everything in an old metal incinerator barrel in the backyard. The prosecutor concluded his reconstruction the following morning. Agnes returned to the house before dawn, having washed away the last traces. And when her husband woke up and asked where Aileen was, she uttered her first, most important lie, the same lie she would repeat for the next 1.5 years. She told him that her granddaughter had left early that morning while he was sleeping. It was a simple, everyday lie, but it was what launched months of searching, gave false hope, and plunged the entire family into a nightmare of uncertainty. Now, the prosecutor concluded, addressing the jury, you have the full picture, a picture of betrayal, rage, and cold-blooded deception. This version, and only this one, explains every piece of evidence in this case. Your task is to compare it with the facts and render your verdict. In his closing speech, the prosecutor presented the jury with a complete, logically constructed and evidence-backed picture of what happened. Now the decision was theirs. The judge read out the final instructions, reminding them to base their decision solely on the facts presented in the courtroom. After that, the 12 jurors rose from their seats and, in complete silence, left the room to retire to the deliberation room. For everyone remaining in the courtroom, the most agonizing part began: the waiting. Hours stretched into an eternity. In the oppressive silence of the courtroom, the main participants in this drama remained frozen. Agnes O'Sullivan sat in the dock with the same stony, impenetrable expression she had maintained throughout the trial. Beside her sat her parents. On the other side, in the front row, sat Thomas. He did not look at his wife. His gaze was fixed on emptiness, and it seemed he neither saw nor heard anything around him. He was a man whose world had been shattered twice, first by the supposed disappearance of his granddaughter, and then by the monstrous truth about his wife. The jury's deliberation was not long, which usually indicates an absence of serious disagreements. In less than 3 hours, the door opened, and they returned to the courtroom. The foreman of the jury held a folded sheet of paper in his hands. He did not look towards the dock. The court clerk took the verdict from him and handed it to the judge. The judge unfolded the paper, read it to himself, and his face did not flinch. He addressed the defendant. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, please stand." Agnes slowly rose. Not a single breath was heard in the courtroom. The judge read the jury's decision in a loud, clear voice that echoed through the hall. On the charge of second-degree murder, the jury finds you guilty. At that moment, Agnes O'Sullivan showed no emotion. She did not flinch, cry, or lower her head. She simply continued to stare straight ahead, as if these words applied to someone else. Thomas, upon hearing the verdict, remained motionless. In his stillness was the full weight of the final realization that the person with whom he had lived for half a century was a complete stranger to him. Justice had been served, but for him, it was not relief, only confirmation of the nightmare. The judge thanked the jury and proceeded to pronounce the sentence. He looked at Agnes and delivered a short speech. He spoke not so much about the legal as about the human side of this case, about the monstrous betrayal of trust within the family, about how the safest place for a child, their grandparents' home, had turned into a crime scene, and about how the lies she had told for 1.5 years had caused her own husband and the rest of the family no less suffering than the act itself. Finishing his speech, he moved to the operative part. Based on the jury's verdict, he pronounced, the court sentences Agnes O'Sullivan to life imprisonment. Restrained sobs could be heard from the bench where Aileen's parents sat. The judge paused and added a clarification as required by law, with the right to apply for parole no earlier than after 20 years. The bang of the judge's gavel officially closed the case. From a legal standpoint, the case of Aileen Murphy was closed. With the bang of the judge's gavel, the paths of two people who had lived together for half a century diverged forever. Agnes O'Sullivan was transferred to a women's prison to begin serving her life sentence. And Thomas O'Sullivan left the courtroom that day for the last time and returned alone to their deserted farm. He did not linger long in a place that had transformed from a family home into a scene of monstrous crime and deception. A few weeks later, a short advertisement appeared in the local newspaper for the sale of the farm with all its property, the very farm that had belonged to the O'Sullivan family for several generations. As soon as the deal was completed, Thomas, without saying goodbye to any of his neighbors, gathered his few belongings, got into his car and drove out of the village in an unknown direction. Thus this story concluded, but some of its pages remained unwritten. Agnes O'Sullivan is serving her sentence to this day. The farm was sold to new owners, completely unrelated to this tragedy, and a different new life began there. However, the further fate and whereabouts of Thomas O'Sullivan remain unknown. The case of Heather Honey, as the investigators unofficially called it, is now stored in the archives of Angada Siocana. It is a thick folder, full of reports, photographs, and expert analyses. But behind the dry facts lies a deep human tragedy that destroyed everything. The O'Sullivan family's history in this place, lasting over 100 years, ended one evening due to a flash of rage and subsequent lies. Thomas O'Sullivan, deceived by his own wife who lost his granddaughter and his home, simply disappeared, taking with him the quiet, untold part of this tragedy.